Pacific National, Australia's largest private rail freight operator, is in the business of moving Australia's economy. Sadly, the business of rail freight has been neglected by government policymakers for decades, resulting in costly inefficiencies infecting Australia's entire transport supply chain. Current government policies are geared towards favouring trucks over trains for hauling freight. Just last year, Australia's first B-Quad monster truck hit the road. This is putting a handbrake on the productivity of Australian rail freight networks at a time when our economy is facing significant economic headwinds. Without efficient rail freight, cost of living pressures for millions of Australian consumers and households will rise. Today, running regional freight trains in and out of our ports requires navigating a maze of substandard infrastructure and network bottlenecks, congested city rail lines, and ever-tightening delivery windows at port. If this continues, industries supporting rail freight will collapse, regional exporters will suffer, private investment will look elsewhere, and jobs will be lost abroad. This is not the Australia Pacific National wants. It's not the Australia anyone wants. Australian rail freight policies are stuck in the era of steam trains. Infrastructure upgrades are bogged down in bureaucracy, and engagement by government agencies with private rail freight companies is poor. The very companies that can invest in the future success of the sector are being left on the policy and economic sidelines. Australia's 19th century rail gauge networks are slowly being standardised, but a myriad of different signalling and train control systems have sprung up. This lack of harmonisation makes running a freight train across the country a logistical nightmare. To make matters worse, access to rail networks is becoming too expensive for above rail operators like Pacific National to compete on a level playing field with road freight. There is a lack of focus within government on improving productivity in the sector. Red tape is choking the life out of rail freight. Rail freight is safer and greener than road freight. And if given a chance by policymakers, we can match the trucking sector in efficiency. For every tonne of freight hauled a kilometre, road freight produces 14 times greater accident costs than rail freight and 16 times as much carbon pollution. Freight and passenger rail transport accounted for a mere 4% of greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector, compared to 20% for trucks, which is projected to grow to 30% by 2030. Larger and heavier trucks result in more wear and tear on Australian roads, costing ratepayers and taxpayers a mint. In New South Wales alone, the NRMA estimates a $2.2 billion backlog in roads maintenance funding. By the time the Inland Rail project is completed in 2025, the key north-south freight corridors of the Pacific and Newell highways will have undergone major upgrades, allowing road freight to overtake rail freight. This will make it easier for the rapid rollout of truck platooning and semi-automation of prime movers. For example, since completion of its duplication in 2013, Pacific National estimates the Hume Highway between Melbourne and Sydney has become a conveyor belt of 700,000 B-double equivalent return truck trips, hauling almost 20 million tonnes of freight each year. If there was an equal share of freight transported by rail and road between Sydney and Melbourne, Pacific National estimates 4 lives and $300 million in road accident costs would be saved each year. Furthermore, the annual truck emissions along the Hume Highway would be reduced by 430,000 tonnes. And when it comes to sensible operating rules and train driver qualifications, rail freight is stuck at the station. A New South Wales freight train driver with more than 25 years' experience can be subjected to 18 months extra training to operate on a similar rail corridor in another state. How do we get rail freight back on track? The Transport and Infrastructure Council of Australia must refashion the office of the National Rail Safety Regulator to expand its vision and mandate beyond just safety, compliance and enforcement. The vision of the rail regulator must also include a keen focus on efficiency and productivity, just like the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator does for the trucking industry. Governments must invest more in dedicated freight lines, passing loops and rail sidings to help separate freight and passenger services. They must actively support the establishment of freight hubs, particularly in capital cities, to help shift freight from road to rail to help ease traffic congestion. The Transport and Infrastructure Council must also recognise the benefits of rail freight in reducing road accidents, emissions and wear and tear to roads. For the sake of Australia's economy and environment, the rail freight sector can no longer be derailed by tons of red tape. We need real trains, not road trains, hauling Australia's freight.